Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
They said when you talk,
I know
like,
it's after
goes in and
lunch,
out.
but I assure you that this panel is amazing and it'll awaken and inspire you because the topic is education and workforce development at scale. Our moderator is Saeed Amiri. He is the Global Marketing Director for LinkedIn's Education Business Vertical. In this role, he drives the team's vision, strategy, and marketing investments, working hand in hand with other global leaders in North America, along with EMEA, APAC, and Brazil. Saeed joined LinkedIn from Apollo Education Group, where he was the VP of Marketing. At Apollo, he led a large organization focused on cross-channel marketing strategy, lifecycle marketing, and new customer acquisition. Prior to Apollo, he held a variety of marketing and business development roles at internet startups such as Like.com and Quinn Street Inc. Saeed has a BA from UCLA and an MBA from the Wharton School. Welcome the panel, and I invite all of you to join in welcoming this amazing panel.
All right, thank you, Vibha. Can you guys hear me in the back? Great, okay, awesome. So thank you for that warm introduction, and I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. As Vibha mentioned, I'm Saeed, and I'm the moderator for the Education and Workforce Development at Scale panel. And I wanted to let the panelists start off and introduce themselves for about 1 or 2 minutes and really talk about introduce yourself, your role with your organization, and what your relation to education and workforce development is. Why don't we start at the end with Cece?
Great. Cece Chang. I run partnerships and business development at a startup called Andela. Andela is the premier technology program for senior leaders in Africa. So our goal is to shape 100,000 software engineers into global leaders over the next 10 years. Andela was founded on the belief that while brilliance and aptitude is equally distributed across the world, opportunity is not. And so there are brilliant people in Africa, there's not the job markets. And so our job is to identify software engineers and help place them into jobs across the world. My relationship with my connection to the topic of this panel is how we do it, why we're doing it, why we're focusing on Africa, and why we think that technical training programs are necessary for the future.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay in the back? Great. My name is Julia Giddis. I'm a product manager at Edmodo. Edmodo is a social learning network that connects teachers, students, and parents around the world. We have around 70 million registered users. About half of them are in the US and half overseas. And we are a classroom management tool for teachers to use in the classroom with students. They can use Edmodo to give assignments and grade and basically go paperless. And we also have a social network for teachers that's a big part of our program, and that's why Edmodo is sometimes called the Facebook for schools, so teachers can connect with other teachers around the world and get support in their teaching. I've been at Edmodo for 1.5 years, and I'm loving being a product manager. Happy to answer any questions about it. I'm on the growth team, so my goals are around growing and customer acquisition. My relationship to education is pretty intimate. My first job was a teacher. I taught at Leadership Public Schools across the Bay in Richmond. And then I taught in Spain. I did a master's in education. I've been on the board of a school called Fenway High School in Boston, which is a pilot public school, and I'm now on the board of a charter school in Oakland called the East Bay Innovation Academy. So really excited to be here. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sinclair Wu. Very nice to have chatted with some of you after the last panel, as well as during lunch. Very excited and inspired to be part of this panel and today's event. My background, I would say, is largely inspired by a quote from Martin Luther King. He talked about how one of life's most urgent and pervasive questions is, what are you doing for others? And I think that's one of those pebbles in my shoe that has gotten me doing a lot of thinking. Come from tech, worked in that world for 10 or 15 years, cared a lot about education, but wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do in that space. Relatively auspiciously, I was driving down 101 and heard this funny ad on the radio. You too can send your kids to the nation's best colleges if you sign them up for one of our SAT classes, which, by the way, cost $1,500 a pop. And I thought, that's so unfair. There's no way that my parents, even if they had wanted to when we were growing up, could have afforded that. And to the extent that that can open up so many doors and affect your college as well as career ambitions, I thought I really need to do something about this. Ended up co-founding a nonprofit that provided free SAT classes to underserved youth in the Bay Area. Right around the same time, I was finishing up this multi-million-dollar project at work. A managing partner comes up to me, pats me on the shoulder, and says, "Great work, Sinclair. We sold another $10 million project. Very exciting, but something was kind of missing." Right around the same time, I got this funny 3-line email from one of my kids. "Yo, homie, I don't like math. I didn't think I was going to like your course, but my scores went up by over 200 points. Thank you for believing in me, and thank you for making a difference." So that planted a seed in me to see how I could be part of a change, using my technology and for-profit career background to perhaps make that much greater of an impact in education. So that's my background in a nutshell. Thank you.
Very cool. Okay, sound check. Great. My name is Eli Kennedy. I'm the CEO of the Level Playing Field Institute. I got into education. I mean, education is something that was always there for me. My mother was a teacher. My first job was as a tutor. When I went to Wharton, I knew I wanted to do good, do well at the same time. Was looking to pivot to have a social impact. And I had Professor Inman, who I don't know if he still teaches this class there, but he had a class called Urban Fiscal Policy that went through basically all the problems that a city faces and how the government should kind of go after those and what the solutions were. So when you talk about crime, and you talk about poverty and blight, and kept coming back to this one solution, which was education. And that really, for me, was a bit of a catalyst to sort of twist me back into focusing on education. Our organization, LPFI, has a flagship program called SMASH, the goal, which is the Summer Math and Science Honors Academy. Our goal is to level the playing field for low-income students and students of color in STEM, so in science, technology, engineering, and math. Our program is a deep investment in these students. They get about 1,000 hours of education over 3 years. The education is a mix of like regular, just bolstering their STEM skills, so learning math, doing computer science, doing project-based engineering, and a bunch of skills also to sort of build the social capital of the student. So really prepare them to go into what can be very different environments if you're a computer science major at a prominent university or once you go into the tech world. So we do that in partnership with 5 different universities. The students actually live at the universities each of their summers of high school, so for 5 weeks. We are with Cal, Stanford, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and Morehouse College working on Wharton. Very quickly, our results. So we take into our program, our students are about 80% low income, about 75% first generation students. Of those students, 100% go on to 4-year colleges. About half of them go to top 50 colleges, the top 1% of colleges in the United States, and about 75% go into STEM majors, which is 3 times the rate that you'll see nationally. So that's our work.
All right, let's dive into it. Thank you, panel, and I'm really excited to just kind of kick us off and get started. Just a little bit of premise and setup for the topic, which is education and workforce development at scale. Within LinkedIn, we talk a lot about what we see and what the World Economic Forum calls the 4th Industrial Revolution. And that's one of the convergence of not only digital platforms, but also robotics and artificial intelligence and health and genomics. And if the first industrial revolution was by steam, the second from electricity, and the third from IT, the World Economic Forum has talked about that we are now in the beginning stages, in the beginning innings, to use an American baseball term, of the 4th Industrial Revolution. And so as it relates to workforce readiness and workforce preparation at scale, at LinkedIn, we talk about this a lot. And education and curriculum for today has to ideally prepare for the jobs and the workforce of tomorrow. And one of the things that I know as a Wharton grad as well, Wharton really does focus around how do we develop leaders both for business as well as social impact organizations and nonprofits at scale. There's nothing wrong with startups. I personally love startups. But we also look at the focus of how do we deliver this at scale to solve some of the social ills and some of the problems of the world that are coming abroad. And we see a lot in terms of today, in terms of the increasing divergence between different and many populations. So I want to open it up to the panel. And I'd love to start with anyone who wants to kind of kick it off. What's your point of view about whether or not we're entering this fourth industrial revolution? And how do you see this affecting the development of workforce and education today?
I'll start. I think absolutely. If you look at the way that that jobs have changed, and what the type of jobs that are lacking people. For example, there are 5 open recs for software engineers in San Francisco for every 1 developer available, right? And as automation spreads across all industries, what's going to happen is you are going to, the middle section of skilled workers, you're going to need, or those jobs are going to disappear, right? So you're going to need higher skill or probably lower skill. So, but that middle section is going to be a ton of jobs that will disappear. And I think if you look at that versus how the education system has changed over the last few decades, it hasn't really changed that much. So we're not really preparing for this shift in paradigm. What you are seeing is a lot of organizations like Girls Who Code, other private institutions that are filling that gap of training people for those higher skill jobs. So I think you are seeing people start to address that problem, but I think it's going to come faster than we think, and it's going to be at a scale that we are not right now prepared to address.
So I'll build on that point. I think that's exactly right. So in California, at the schools that have the highest portion of low-income students, basically 75% of those schools don't even have a computer science course, right? This is in California, right? The shadow of Silicon Valley. Only 2% of those schools offer an AP computer science course. And at the same time, those jobs that you're talking about, those software engineers, basically the prerequisite for that goes all the way back to high school. And basically, I mean, now it's changing a little bit because of boot camps and whatnot, but a lot of those folks that are sitting in those seats right now are folks that took that AP computer science course. So how do you ever close that gap? And turning that system, so a massive public education system that's been very, very slow to change over time is really, really difficult, and is going to be critical for us to keep up in this fourth industrial revolution. It's going to be critical that we actually catch up there, but there's so many challenges doing that in the public sector. So one, just the inertia of the sector. 2, you need quality. You need to be able to teach computer science, which, if it's hard to get software engineers at jobs that are starting at mid 100s or 200s, paying someone to teach in a public school at $40,000 a year to teach computer science is that much harder. So there's a lot that we need to do to sort of change and prepare this workforce for these new types of jobs, and our systems are all sort of entrenched against that right now.
Maybe building off of both of those great points, I think this is such a multi-dimensional, multifaceted topic. I'll try and break it down into maybe the overlap that I've seen in technology, personalization, as well as purpose. And I think these are things that the fourth revolution are enabling us to think about and perhaps achieve that much more. So from a technology perspective, just a few years back, it was big data, analytics, fintech, more recently, cybersecurity. Now it's AI and machine learning. And as part of these technology trends, there are all these schools that emerged to oftentimes train people up in the relevant skills. So we saw a lot of coding schools, for example. And one quote that I hear very often that sums up one of the challenges and opportunities in that intersection is, there's an emerging and growing gap between those who can and those who want to. Are the people who are picking up these skills going to be able to nurture their skills and themselves in a way to sustain themselves as well as society at large? And that's where then going to the points around personalization and purpose, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. There's a Japanese phrase, ikigai. That is the intersection of 4 key things. It's what you're good at, your skills. It's what you love to do, your passions. It's what the world needs you to do, and it's what the world wants you to do. So I think we'll be talking about the LinkedIn economic graph later on. I think there's a humongous opportunity to think about people not as static individuals with static sets of interests or technology skills or other skills for that matter, but people who are dynamic and are also thinking about not only whatever skills happen to be most relevant, but also personalization and what might be of greatest meaning and purpose to them.
Great points. I was finding this question challenging, and I was thinking, wait, what was the Industrial Revolution again? So I had to Wikipedia this earlier. But I was thinking, 4th Industrial Revolution, wait, schools haven't even caught up to the 3rd. And when you look at education, for example, in the US, was highly impacted by the 2nd Industrial Revolution. So if you look at how manufacturing and the assembly line impacted the US economy, that's basically how schools are run. Schools are run very much like an assembly line model. And we never caught up in education sector to the 3rd Industrial Revolution, with communication and digitization changing the face of so many other industries, but not education. And so now we see schools playing catch up to the 3rd. And so leaping ahead to the 4th is kind of a mind-blowing thing to think about. And I think CC kicked it off correctly by saying there's no way we're prepared. And when I think about schools that are successfully catching up to the digital revolution, I see teachers harnessing the power of everyone being connected through mobile devices. So that's something that we're all a part of in so many ways, but still not in schools. And when you see the power of teachers and students connecting with each other through the web, we're still at the very beginnings of seeing how that influences education in the classroom. And I think the skills that students will need when we talk about the 4th Industrial Revolution are going to be about finding the right people and finding the right resources. And that's why I love seeing teachers and students engage on platforms like Edmodo, where they're gaining those skills of being part of a network, finding resources, sharing and connecting with each other, because those skills are going to help them get to the 4th. But I worry about skipping the 3rd.
So Sinclair touched on a term that at LinkedIn is, we sometimes think it's a little bit of inside baseball, and it's called the economic graph. And for those of you that are familiar with LinkedIn, a lot of the perception in the marketplace is that LinkedIn is a professional social network, and it's where you go to get a job. On the recent close of the Microsoft acquisition of LinkedIn, LinkedIn's true north vision was really to create what we call the economic graph. And the economic graph, in simple terms, is a digital mapping of the economy and all the connections and nodes that facilitate within it. And so the way that actually manifests itself is that LinkedIn, and a lot of the conversations through the acquisition have been focused on, okay, how do we actually realize this vision with a bigger backing of Microsoft now, to create a profile for every knowledge worker globally on this planet, to get all of the jobs that are available on this planet onto the platform, to map and list and allocate all of the skills that everyone needs to have and know for this 4th Industrial Revolution onto the platform and assigned to all the different members, to have the educational providers, whether they be degree granting institutions or alternative players, on the platform that can provide those skills, and then mapping all of the employers, companies, organizations, social impact players, and nonprofits onto the platform as well, and then creating all of the nodes that then flow between each one of those as connections, and allowing the capital, whether it be knowledge, financial, whatever it is, to flow between all those nodes. That's the true vision, and I think that's what we're hoping to realize through the acquisition of Microsoft. I'm curious, as it relates to creating those nodes and connections and improving the workforce at scale, what's your point of view on the economic graph, and what's missing, and what would you think could be added, or what's your point of view in general? Why don't we start with Eli?
So, I mean, I think with the thing, I mean, from my perspective, again, what we see is that there is a challenge in the pipeline for low-income students, for students of color, into getting into tech, into getting into these STEM jobs. There is also the other side of this, which there are things that the companies need to do different. And there's things, even if you're creating an economic graph that does have this sort of matching between jobs and people, that there's certain biases and things that we need to be cognizant of and aware of and sort of deconstruct, so that we make sure, to get to your earlier point, that we're unearthing all of the talent that's within the world and within the country. So, you know, when you get to a situation where you have these engineering jobs and they're posted and everyone just wants that Stanford engineer, or that, you know, the engineer from a certain college has a certain score and whatever, like, those are good markers and good predictors of success, but they cannot be the only predictors of success. And so what I worry about, or what I would if I were shaping this, the thing that I would want to make sure is that we're thinking much more broadly about like what genius looks like, and how we can match people who have the talent to go to and do lots of different things, and not just force them through the funnel of 15 different schools in the United States that all the tech companies are targeting their graduates of.
That's actually one of the problems that Andela is faced with. That's difficult for us. In the last 2 years, we've had, at this point, just about 50,000 software engineers apply to join us, and we've accepted a little over 200. So that's a 0.5% acceptance rates. And the people are fantastic, but to your point, when we're talking to companies about why they should hire, there's a question of, well, what are their backgrounds, what have they done, where they go to school, the usual questions you would ask. But we don't have those things to point to, because this is a very different cultural background. They came from a very different economy. And so where do people like that fit on this graph, and how do you create a universal language for what talent is, and how do you create objective bars? And I think that's an extreme example. Another thing that we did at Andela is we actually, in the application process, got rid of the resume, because we realized that was deterring a lot of really talented people from even considering joining us, because they didn't think that they had the background that would even suit a resume. And so that was something that really increased our application pool for the better. But even in the US, the way that we take applications, the things that we look for, how people speak, how people dress, I agree. There's a lot of things that, yes, are taken offline that might be difficult to fit on that specific graph.
And sort of diving deeper on that one,
Yeah.
From the panel standpoint, what do you guys see as the most impactful changes, or things that really do need to change to enable workforce development around everything that exists around implicit bias, or things that are currently standards today that you all believe need to change to really drive workforce development at scale?
I can speak to that a little bit from the perspective of a tech company here. So as a product manager, my job is to work with a team of lovable, nerdy engineers who hail from all over the world. And so on my engineering team right now, I have 2 engineers from China, 2 engineers from India, an engineer from Brazil, an engineer from Ukraine. It's a very diverse group of people, except for their gender. And when I think about recruiting, I often think about the training necessary for our hiring managers as well. I would love to see a shift in looking more at portfolios, and this is where I think EdTech could have a huge ability to contribute. So Edmodo, for example, we have 60 million student portfolios that I'm hoping we are able to do more with, but I think students being able to showcase their work and being judged by their work, as opposed to things like test scores or where you went to school, to Eli's point, are definitely the wave of the future. I think students who don't fit traditional mold of an engineer, for example, should have the ability to showcase their skills, but hiring managers need to also be trained on how to interpret them, because I am picturing my very sweet hiring manager right now, and I think if she saw someone with a non-traditional background, it would be challenging for her to know how to evaluate it, right? So the training needs to go both ways. And to a related point, because Eli was sort of alluding to this, it made me think about the achievement gap and the role that ed tech companies have. And one thing we often think about at Edmodo is, does ed tech help close the achievement gap, or in some ways is it actually exacerbating it? And when you have an ed tech company that's based on people being connected to the internet and having mobile devices, like even the access to that is in some ways a factor and something we have to look into. And I'm happy to go into more detail about it, but in the last month, I did a lot of research talking to our users who get SMS updates, and we were about to turn that feature off because everyone at Edmodo thought the SMS updates were really lame and broken, and we were just gonna shut it down, and completely changed our mind after getting some user feedback.
I think building off of the notion of predictors of success that Eli alluded to earlier, this is a very interesting and frankly very complicated space. I think maybe building off of some of the ideas that Julia shared as well, I was thinking of watching a YouTube video. I don't admit this very often, but I like the music competition show The Voice. We've all seen chairs spinning around. I thought, why isn't that the case for education and workforce development or jobs, where you're evaluated not based on superficial characteristics, but how you are singing, or in this case, writing, coding, whatever the case might be. How can a more fair, skills-based system be put into place? That's one humongous topic in and of itself. I'll just leave my point at that for now. I think one other dimension of our conversation, there's an interesting trend around looking not only at IQ, of course, and maybe EQ starting a few years back, but now more recently XQ. What is that X factor that makes people good at their jobs? It's sometimes not just IQ and EQ. There's a certain personality fit. What are those things that we can also think about to then enable people to be that much more successful, as well as their organizations?
The only thing I would add is, so there is some really cool technology out there that is creating that voice effect. So there's something called Interview.io, which basically allows you to give a technical interview, but without the bias. So it's sort of a blind technical interview. So there's that sort of thing where you're just openly acknowledging, like, we have biases in how we see people. Not that that's okay, but let's just acknowledge that exists, and let's use technology to sort of ameliorate some of that. So I think that's one thing. There are technologies out there that can help out there that can create that voice effect that you're alluding to. The other thing I think is important is just for the CEOs and the leader of these companies to just be really committed to not continuing to fish out of the same pools. We've all probably hired people in the past, and the first thing you do when you hire someone, I mean, sure, you post a job, but you're like, who do I know, right? And there's so much of that who do I know that if you have an extremely homogenous group of people, they're gonna come up with the same list of folks all the time. So there is work that has to be done and commitment to sort of go out of just like the laziness of hiring, which hiring is a pain in the ass. It takes a lot of time. There's risk associated with it. But if we're ever going to sort of help and sort of bring in new pools of talent, there's really has to be this commitment for the CEO to say, like, fish in different pools of talent. And that means like putting aside your Rolodex for a little bit.
And maybe very quickly tying back in the LinkedIn economic graph that Saeed alluded to earlier. I think there's a tremendous opportunity around looking at people not just in terms of who they are currently, in terms of their skill sets as well as their interests, but who they want to be. And this ties into a little bit of that XQ factor. I think a lot of the tools that are out there, you submit a resume, you submit your LinkedIn profile, your static set of data points. And I was actually having an interesting conversation with someone who's been in recruiting for 10 years. And she said that over 2 years, she found an interesting insight that it took a big data company much longer to identify, and that was, in order to find her best front-end developers, these are people who do HTML, CSS, the front-end design of web pages, she said that there was one very intuitive item and one non-intuitive item. The intuitive one was a degree from a 4-year institution in computer science. The non-intuitive one was an interest in photography. For those people who are interested in photography, she found they also had not only a greater aesthetic sense, but a greater willingness to understand the perspective of designers and people who sometimes on a team would create some conflict across engineering, product managers, marketing, et cetera. And so that was a fascinating insight into how people may end up being better matched with jobs that they themselves may not even have thought about. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity for the LinkedIn economic graph.
Interesting.
Turning to social impact orgs and nonprofits, maybe starting with Eli and Sinclair, given your background, what's your view of the role that social impact orgs and nonprofits play with privates? And what's your sort of view of how those work together or perhaps work against each other?
I think it goes back to, I'll start. I think the point around the public school systems or the public entities just being really, really slow at change makes it really important for nonprofits and privates to drive a lot of the change when it comes to education and thinking differently about how we prepare our workforce. So we as a nonprofit and a private organization can move just so much faster in saying let's do something really different than the California State of Department of Education can, or Oakland Public Schools. Like, we can just change much more quickly. So there is a role in us for being innovators, right? Of like trying new things, doing new things, and then when we do them, sort of the research component of studying them and hoping to transition them into the public sector, I think is sort of, that would be for me like the vision of the role. We were talking before we came in here. Still, changing the public system is really, really difficult, but it is really the only mechanism for scale. So that's the sort of dual challenge here, is that we can be, privates and nonprofits can be really, really significant innovators, but to reach a scale point, at some point you have to plug into the public sector. And I think that's the part that's the other part maybe that we don't think about enough, publics and nonprofits, like, hey, I'm doing this really cool thing and this is my work, but really thinking about how can I somehow like create this or make this into a vaccine or something that's replicable and scalable, that if I can plug it into a public institution, they can run with it.
Very much agree. I think perhaps one of the greatest simultaneous challenges and opportunities in this space is how to mesh the best of both of these worlds so as to better achieve that collective impact. I popped into the panel before this to just get some ideas, because as a speaker, I oftentimes find the other people have more interesting things to say. And one person in the previous panel talked about humility, which reminded me of this Zen concept called Shoshin, or a beginner's mindset. And I think that idea is one where the more for-profit organizations, social impact organizations, nonprofit organizations think about and keep in mind when they collaborate with others, the more that collective impact can be achieved at scale. Related to that, but on a brief tangent, I'll share a perspective on the so-called new golden rule. Many of you perhaps have heard the golden rule about doing unto others. There's a new golden rule referred to as the platinum rule. And that is, instead of doing unto others what you would want for yourself, it's thinking about, first and foremost, what the other person or other organization may want, and then doing unto them what they actually want for themselves. It's a subtle, but I think very important nuance, because I find a lot of organizations collaborating with their own interests first. And especially in the social impact space, I think that humility, that beginner's mindset, enables both for-profits looking at more social impact or CSR initiatives, as well as nonprofits and social enterprises to work that much more cohesively together.
Cece, I'd love your thoughts as head of partnerships for Andela, talking on doing unto other organizations, or starting with your point of view. What's your thoughts?
Sure. So I've spent my entire career in for-profit organizations, as heartless as that may sound. Before Andela, I was at a seed venture capitalist firm, first round, and I ran a seed fund that invested in student entrepreneurs. So there's a mission element there, but it was for-profit as well. And Andela is the same. We are for-profit, but with an eye on the impact that we're having. My view on this is it's actually interesting to observe how I think you're starting to see an evolution of companies becoming more focused on CSR, and not just for the PR benefits. Foundations that are actually doing something more than just writing checks. And so for me, from the for-profit side, I think the role, the responsibility and the role of a company to its stakeholders and not just its shareholders is something interesting to observe. The company has the way that we think of a company and the financial returns being the only sole focus. Has not always been the case historically, and I think you're starting to see a little bit of a shift towards paying more attention to the social returns, the environmental returns, et cetera. So that's not exactly an answer to your question specifically, but amusing from the for-profit side, how they're starting to pay more attention to things that nonprofits have always prided them on, the returns that nonprofits pride themselves on. On the other hand as well, I think a lot of nonprofits, if you look at their model, one of the things that a lot of them have shifted towards is a more sustainable model. Should it be a nonprofit or should it be a for-profit? What is the best way to reach your ultimate goal? Yeah.
And Julia, we want to turn to education a bit, and specifically about education. There's a big narrative around the disruption of the degree, and you're starting to see employers no longer require a 4-year degree as part of the critical requirements to apply for a particular position. At LinkedIn, we believe that may spread, but there will be a tier that will not change no matter what. And tell us a little bit more about your point of view on that narrative and that concept, and what your point of view is with Edmodo.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned earlier I'm a big fan of student portfolios for that reason. One thing we're exploring more of, Edmodo has this concept of badging where teachers can award badges to students and teachers can also earn badges from each other. And I think they were just sort of a pet project on the side, but they've really taken off and is one of sort of the key features of Edmodo. And there's other companies in the ed tech space like Class Dojo, for example, that are pretty much really focused on the badging concept. And I think badging lends itself really naturally into micro-credentialing. And we see the beginnings of badging and micro-credentialing on Edmodo, where teachers, for example, are able to go through certain professional development, either mandated through their district or state, or that they've pursued independently, and they've been awarded digital badges that they can then show off on their teacher profiles on Edmodo that are sort of their sign and signal of their knowledge and completion. So I love seeing the work with badges on Edmodo. I think that it's really the beginning of showcasing your work in other ways. I don't think we're close to the point where people aren't cherry picking the Stanford engineers for the jobs. I think we still have a really heavy weight that people put on the brand. But I think it's something that people are starting to explore, and I'm really excited about whenever I see on Edmodo. And when I think about the economic graph at LinkedIn, we're sort of building the educational graph at Edmodo because we have so many resources that are shared on our platform every day. So we have hundreds of millions of resources that have been shared on Edmodo, links, attachments, files, lesson plans, teachers posting assignments to their students, teachers posting in our marketplace for free resources on Edmodo. And we're trying to get to the point where we can recommend the best content to the right person at the right time. And I think that's where that just-in-time learning is something that's very new and we're looking into exploring. I think as was alluded to earlier, as we move away from the established frameworks of education, it's really going to be about what are you looking for right now. And speaking to the previous question around nonprofits, that's where we have some amazing partnerships with nonprofits. So for example, Common Sense Media has shared a whole bunch of amazing digital literacy resources that they've created, and they're looking for further distribution, and then we're able to distribute on our platform for teachers. And I think digital literacy is often the beginning for students to learn about technology in general, and how do you be a citizen of the internet and know what you're navigating, especially this year. And the other partnership that I want to highlight is with the Representation Project, which is a really cool organization run by Jennifer Siebel-Newsome. And I highly encourage you guys to watch the 2 movies that she's directed in the last couple of years. And that's Misrepresentation, which is about gender in media, and The Mask You Live In, which is about the evolution of boys from middle school to high school. And they have so many great lesson plans and resources that they've created as a nonprofit, and then they partner with us to distribute those to teachers. So really thinking about how can we get the content to the right person at the right time, and then that person's learning, and then recognize that learning in a different way from just a check mark on an assignment.
Yeah. I'd love to open up to the panel around the notion of the disruption of the degree and your thoughts.
Obviously we're seeing the coding bootcamp thing. I think it's probably one of the bigger things we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of our students, or many of our students who are in their second or third year, and they've conceived of an app and they want to, maybe build it out, saying like, how do I go to Make School or Learner's Guild or one of these coding boot camps to sort of learn a set of skills. I think it's a pretty interesting trend for organizations to sort of teach really specific skills that lead to high-paying jobs. I feel like the sort of post-secondary world hasn't changed that much. There's a sort of set of brands that you mentioned, like top tier, that will always lean on their brands, and then a bunch of other folks that are struggling with like, what am I actually trying to teach here? Like, what's the goal? And there is, obviously if you go to college and even if you're talking to a young person, there's so much more there than just learning a set of skills. But a lot of them are walking out of schools with no brand, no skills, and really in a bunch of debt. So this trend where you can get some very specific marketable skills connected to job placement at a really cheap price is one I think that's going to accelerate. I think we need to be careful that it's not sort of vocational and sort of keep an eye on what exactly it's putting people into. And I think there will continue to be a question for those folks that enter at a certain place, like, well, what happens 5 years from now? Are there ceilings for those students? And that's something else I think people need to think about. But I think the trend of providing, again, very specific skills at a very cheap price point is something that will accelerate and should really be explored. I think there's really a lot of value there.
I'm going to take one more question. I know we've got about 10 minutes left, and so I wanted to open it up to Q&A for the audience after this. But I want to close on something that's a little bit controversial, and diversity and inclusion. And this is such a hot topic in Silicon Valley right now and globally. There's disagreements around whether or not it's a pipeline issue, whether it's more systemic, and there are issues around systemic bias. And I wanted to open it up to the panel to, as it relates to employment within desirable fields, STEM, otherwise, or globally, what's your point of view of how to create a balance of diversity and inclusion, and what do companies and social impact organizations need to do to achieve that mission and parity to make the workforce within highly desirable fields look more like the world at large?
I'll go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one, I guess I would start off by saying, for me, it's not just about looking at the world at large. It's also a question of like, what kind of innovation are we going to get at the end of the day? I think we've had a really interesting wave of innovation. If you ask people who are smart around here, they'll tell you the companies they're excited about, and they'll talk about Slack, and they'll talk about Nuzzle, and they'll talk about these organizations that are like, these are cool little tools for a certain set of society that are like saving you time and whatnot. But in terms of like the real problems that are around the corner for people of the world, like that's not where they are. So I think if we bring in people with really different experiences, we probably will get a broader set of innovations. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, we talked a little bit about companies need to change. I think there is a lot of work. So I was talking to someone at Facebook yesterday, and they started out by saying, we're looking for this person, right? So it's like, we're looking for someone who's just been super resourceful and taught themselves to code on YouTube and like did all this stuff. And like, are you? Because what you're hiring are people that like went to really affluent schools and have been getting investments in summer coding classes since they were 6 years old, and like that's what you're getting. So are you really looking for that person? And the true answer is like, not really, but something between that, right? So there is some investment I think that companies, the public and whatnot need to make in ensure that not only students from affluent communities are getting the skills to get them into those engineering jobs and beyond.
Part of me is optimistic in that just looking at general trends, most companies are going to offer flexible work hours, you're going to be able to work remotely. It's just what people are wanting, and technology is at our back. So even 2 years ago, a video call was more difficult than it is now with VR, et cetera. Communication technology is improving constantly. There are lots of surveys about how millennials want flexible work hours. And because of that, and if you look at companies in Europe, for example, it's very common that you can't hire just within your country. The countries are also closer together. And so because of that, if you're starting to think smart about how you're going to hiring the best people, then I think there's going to be a natural push to hiring beyond your own backyard. I think it's places like San Francisco and Silicon Valley that is going to move the slowest ironically, the hub of innovation. I think this is a place where we are going to see the slowest change because there is the money and the ability and a culture of trying to build a company with people that fit your culture, or trying to build a company the way that other successful founders have, which in the past have been hiring people who from Ivy League schools and a very specific set of people. As a woman, as a minority, I think that one of the things that I've seen work well in getting more women and more minorities into your company is acting as, if you're in a position, if you're in a leadership position or a management position, just being supportive and mentoring and putting extra effort into building your own ecosystem. I think that the more change comes from within. So the more that you do on a day-to-day basis to help and to be vocal about it, the more that helps.
And just to build on that, I think Cece makes a really good point. A lot of high schools that pride themselves on really high graduation rates, even from under-resourced neighborhoods, will still find that the college completion rates are really low. And I think we'll face a similar situation here where, yes, you can get the job, but are you going to stay in the job? Similar to what Eli was alluding to as well. But it's really hard to be like other in a lot of ways, and it's hard to be the only X, Y, or Z at a company, and it's really hard to be that first woman or that first person of color or the only X on your team, let alone your company. So I think that really intentional support coming from the top down and the effort to build a supportive community to support diverse views is really important, because otherwise you're only sort of halfway there by opening the door. You have to make sure that people walk through.
Maybe tying together both some technological or technical perspectives as well as some social ones. Some of my data analytics or quant friends talk about lazy matching. Oh, you went to this school, you have these skills, so therefore you'll be good in this job. That's quite lazy matching. And are there other factors, like the ones that my fellow panelists have alluded to, that actually may lead to better matches both for the job seeker and the company in the long run as well? I think so. And then going to the social or social emotional side of things, I think one of the big sets of buzz phrases in both education as well as workforce development encompass empathy, compassion, and grit. And people talk about these things. I think there are actually concrete ways in which these ideas can be concretely implemented. For example, in discussions around cultural fit. There was a professor out of Northwestern, I believe, who did an interesting study on this notion of cultural fit. And long story short, I think the takeaway from that effort was a lot of people thought that cultural fit was a relatively objective and fair thing, when at the end of the day, it ended up being how the final interviewer or the person determining whether or not you got the offer or not felt he or she could work with you. And then how do we, given the natural subjectivity associated with something like that, begin to build greater mindfulness around implicit biases and how we've maybe made decisions up to this point as we aim to make better decisions in the future.
Thank you. I'd love to open it up to the audience. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and I'll do my best to repeat the question if you don't have a mic, and we'll go from there. Yep.
So I work at a social impact investment fund. We invested actually in, we have an impact investment fund. We invested in Learner Skill, which provides coding to lower income Americans here in the Bay Area. And one of the things that really keeps me up at night is that, in 7 to 10 years, let's say coding is just commoditized and templated. What happens to all these kids who really spent years and time and money learning this trade that once again gets commoditized and the ball continues to move? So I guess my question fundamentally is how can we focus more on social capital and trying to really build in really fish hooks to get people connected so that they can not be at risk once
Yeah, so the question for the stream is, if and when coding becomes commoditized, how do we focus on social capital so that populations of learners aren't left out?
It's funny, I was just on another panel where the topic was, are we creating technology ghettos by training essentially skilled digital workers, but low-skilled digital workers? Are we just pushing the problem to 5 years down the road? I think it's a really good question. I don't really have a good answer for it. I think one thing that my company was very careful about in the beginning, we work with a different demographic of people, but even on the extremely high skill, the higher skill level, we definitely focus intensively on thinking about launching their career and not just finding a job. So when a developer joins Andela, they go through 6 months of both hard skill training, but also soft skill training. So how you conduct yourself in an interview, what does it feel like to work for a national company, all of those communication skills that are supposed to, we think of it as an investment for the long run. So really thinking about the person holistically, not just preparing for the job at hand, but 10 years down the road.
I think there's going to have to be a lot of different solutions. So in our work, we don't just teach skills, we teach the whole thing, right? So we give them a network of students they can lean on. We teach them sort of leadership skills, social justice, like a bunch of different stuff that really work around the whole student. I think it's unlikely that every student's going to be able to get that level of investment. So I think for the students that are coming through the Learner's Guild, the boot camps of the world, I think the question is, like, what's the next piece after that? I think is something that if you're looking around the corner in your Learner's Guild, like, I think that's one thing I would think about. The other thing I would think about is there's some like foundational knowledge, like this sort of underlying thinking about how, like thinking about coding and sort of the logic associated with that I think probably shouldn't be skipped even in boot camps. So I was talking to a professor at Stanford the other day who has like a logic curriculum, and it's just like, it's the underpinnings of coding, the way calculus is the underpinnings of physics. Like it's just some base like thinking and way of thinking that you need to understand that you can't really skip over if you're going to be a coder long term. And so I just think that, I don't know Learner's Guild's curriculum that well, but I think that like foundational piece probably should never be skipped over.
That's a great point. We've noticed that as well, and even with our developers too, that it depends on, this goes to early education, it depends on how good those fundamentals are, and that's something that I think that actually the US school system actually does a fairly decent job, but yeah, it's a very good point.
And perhaps alongside that, there's also an opportunity to think more about a self-actualization component, if you will. Whereas I alluded to earlier, sometimes I hear the phrase, there's a growing gap between those who can, say, code, and those who really want to. I was talking with a friend who's been in tech for the past 15, 20 years, and he's hiring a lot of graduates from some of these coding schools. And he said they can do that base level of HTML page, however, they just don't have that drive. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I love coding so much, I feel like I was coding even when I was in the womb. And the instant I popped out, I was doing anything and everything technology-wise. And so then the broader question is, well, how do we help these job seekers, youth, whomever, find those seeds of motivation to help themselves be that much more successful? I think there's an interesting opportunity there.
One more question. So if you don't get your question answered, please stay after. I know I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I think people have a few minutes. So I know you had raised your question.
Yes, the question I had was, I'm going to use the analogy of this Amazon Go. So they started with, they drove out all Barnes and Noble, so they went from retail to e-tail to now retail again. So in terms of education, I know we are seeing a lot of MOOCs, that is online learning. So taking into account that we want students not only to acquire education, but also to be able to work together and share ideas, how do you see in-person learning and MOOCs playing out 20 years, 50 years from now?
I'll take that first. That's a good question. I don't think in-person is going anywhere, as my initial comments about the second revolution alluded to. To the earlier point as well, to the question about how do you teach these soft skills, I think the answer lies somewhere in creativity with technology. And I just want to share a couple of anecdotes of teachers I talked to recently who blew my mind with the creative ways they were using technology in the classroom, and I think could tie together to MOOCs in the future. So I was talking to a teacher in Australia a few weeks ago who teaches environmental science to his 7th graders, and they're on an online platform. It happens to be Edmodo, it doesn't have to be. And he has a character from the future come in and talk to them, and they have to try to save her world. And so the way he uses this platform is by really opening their imaginations to helping save this girl, and how do we build the future so that she's still alive. And that narrative, fictional narrative platform that he created builds creativity not only for the teacher but for the students as well, and I love that model. And then I was just talking this week to a teacher in Spain who teaches history, and I guess she was teaching the history of slavery, including the US Civil War, and was talking about Abraham Lincoln. And so she gave her middle school students a quiz online, and then Abraham Lincoln came in and commented on the quiz answers, and he would respond and give input and say, actually, like, this is wrong, here's what I said. And that makes history come alive for kids, and you can't do that in person. And it's this blending of teacher and student creativity online that I think is so much of a positive indicator for the future, and it has to do with catching up to that 3rd industrial revolution. Like, how can we capture the creativity of being connected digitally and spark that imagination for students and that critical thinking? And I think those are skills that teachers need first in order to pass on to students, but that's where I see the future of MOOCs going, is project-based learning that has to do with these really creative uses of technology.
I think that is one of the true million-dollar questions. Great question, Viba. To balance, on the one hand, the personalization and human connectedness of in-person interaction with the scalability, potential virality of MOOCs and technology solutions. It's a humongous topic. I will sum up my thoughts with a paradox I learned about recently called the Jevons paradox. It first alluded to some innovators, maybe even in the 18th century, who were trying to find ways to use coal more efficiently. But paradoxically or ironically, the more innovations they found to use coal more effectively in a way to hopefully reduce coal reduction, the presence of these technologies actually enabled more use of more coal. Just the opposite effect. So in the social media space, I see the Jevons paradox applied when a lot of my friends on Facebook, I'm not on Facebook, I have 0 friends in the virtual world, tell me that they feel maybe not as happy or less connected, even though they have some of these tools that, in theory, enable them to be more connected. Right? And there was an interesting, I think, article in The Economist about that. Anyway, is there a way to think about that reality that we're seeing while still keeping in mind the importance of human connectedness? And I talk with a lot of high schoolers, millennials, and they said, no, we would much prefer, if given the choice to have a MOOC-like environment or an in-person, we would prefer the in-person interaction. How do we combine the best of both worlds? Would love to chat with all of you further about that.
So I think we'll leave it there. Please join me in a round of applause in thanking this esteemed panel.